right, this is part 2 of the lecture for chapter 12, Social Psychology. We're going to pick up where we left off. We're just dealing with aggressive behaviors. Now we're going to deal with helping behaviors and the factors that can influence them. Pro-social behaviors are actions that tend to benefit others, such as doing favors or helping. Why are humans pro-social? They are motivated by empathy. They could be motivated by selfish motives, for example, to relieve one's negative mood, and an inborn tendency to help others. Altruism. This is providing help when it is needed without any apparent reward for doing so. The fact that people help others and even risk personal safety to do so may seem contrary to evolutionary principles. Evolutionary explanations. Inclusive fitness. This is an explanation for altruism that focuses on the adaptive benefit of transmitting genes, such as through kin selection, rather than focusing on individual survival. From an evolutionary perspective, people are altruistic toward those with whom they share genes. This is kin selection. Through helping non-relatives, altruistic animals may also increase the likelihood that other members of the social group will reciprocate when needed. Reciprocal helping. Bystander intervention. There was a lady that was murdered in New York City. Her name was Kitty Genovese. She was murdered while walking home from work in New York City. There were witnesses to the crime, and they reportedly did nothing to help. An assailant savagely attacked her for half an hour, eventually killing her. At the time, a newspaper reported that none of the 38 witnesses to the crime tried to help or called the police. Few of the witnesses were able to observe what happened, and a couple of people did call the police. So that means that the police took up to 30 minutes to respond to this call in New York City. That seems just a tad bit crazy. Here's a picture of this person. The news reported that 38 witnesses failed to help her. A couple of psychologists named Latané and Darley conducted studies in which people were placed in situations that indicated they should seek help. The bystander intervention effect. This is the failure to offer help by those who observe someone in need when other people are present. Research indicates 4 major reasons for the bystander intervention effect. Diffusion of responsibility, in that most of these people that heard what was going on with the lady being murdered, they assumed, well, somebody else heard it and they're calling the police, so they decided to do nothing. That's the diffusion of responsibility. Who was going to make the call? There's also a fear of making social blunders in ambiguous situations. In a place like New York City, who knows what's really going on when somebody screams? Some people might feel that stepping out and assuming that a murder is happening might make them look silly in social situations. Also, people are less likely to help when they are anonymous and can remain so. So maybe you heard somebody scream and you're like, well, I don't really want to deal with that, and you just kind of quietly do nothing. People also weigh the costs versus benefits of helping. What if they help and the murderer is still nearby and decides to include them in their murdering? In Latané and Darley's experiments, participants waited with 2 apathetic Confederates, with 2 other naive participants, or alone. This chart records the participants' reactions to smoke filling the room slowly. You can see in the graph here with the Confederates, those with the apathetic Confederates did not seek assistance in either 3 minutes or 6 minutes. In the group where there are 3 naive participants, after 6 minutes, people started to ask for help. When the smoke started to fill the room, those who were on their own went for help quickly. Cooperation can reduce outgroup bias. Since the 1950s, social psychologists have worked with politicians, activists, and others in numerous attempts to alleviate the hostility and violence between factions. Social psychology may be able to suggest strategies for promoting intergroup harmony and producing greater tolerance for outgroups. The first study to suggest so was conducted in the 1950s by Sharif and colleagues. Phase 1 and 2 of Sharif's competition and cooperation study. During Phase 1 of Sharif's study of competition and cooperation, boys from the two summer camps were pitted against one another and became hostile to one another. During Phase 2, the two groups had to work together to achieve common goals. The shared goals led to cooperation and a reduction of hostility between the groups. How do attitudes guide behavior? Attitudes are people's evaluations of objects, events, or ideas. Attitudes are shaped by social context, and they play an important role in how we evaluate and interact with other people. People form attitudes through experience and socialization. People tend to develop negative attitudes about new things more quickly than they develop positive attitudes about them. The mere exposure effect. This is the idea that greater exposure to a stimulus leads to greater liking for it. Attitudes are acquired via classical conditioning. For example, advertisers associate products with celebrities. And operant conditioning. For example, rewarding a student for studying may create a positive attitude towards studying. Here's a picture of Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister. If he is like most people, he will prefer the image on the right versus the image to the left. The one on the right is a mirror image. There's nothing wrong with the photographic image. It's just that he will simply be more familiar with the mirror image from looking in a mirror. Attitude, behavior, consistency. Stronger, more personally relevant attitudes are more likely to predict behavior. Someone who grew up in a strongly democratic household around condescending attitudes of the other party is more likely to register as a Democrat and vote Democratic than someone who grew up in a more politically neutral environment. I read this in the book and I was like, well, wouldn't that be true of both parties? And why would they not mention that? And is leaving that out mean something? I'm kind of curious about that. The more specific the attitude, the more predictive it is. An attitude about recycling is more predictive of actual recycling than a general attitude about the environment. Attitudes formed through direct experience tend to predict behavior better. Attitude accessibility is the ease or difficulty that a person has in retrieving an attitude from memory. Explicit and implicit attitudes. An explicit attitude is one that a person can report. An implicit attitude, then, is an influence of a person's feeling and behavior at an unconscious level. And this leads to the implicit association test. In this test, when a word appears on a screen, a person has to select whether it is bad or good or is a male name or a female name. For example, in condition 1, the person presses the left button to indicate male or good and the right button to indicate female or bad. Which buttons to press changes in the different conditions. They pair the different names in different combinations. Females are more likely to quickly press the female or good button than they would the female or bad button. Reaction times are measured, which indicates the degree of bias. Discrepancies lead to dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is an uncomfortable mental state resulting from a contradiction between two attitudes or between an attitude and a behavior. For example, people experience cognitive dissonance when they smoke, even though they know that smoking might kill them in the long run. People reduce dissonance by changing their attitudes or behavior. They sometimes also rationalize or trivialize the discrepancies. Insufficient justification. One way to get people to change their attitudes is to change their behaviors first, using as few incentives as possible. In one of the original dissonance studies, participants performed an extremely boring task and then reported to the other participants how enjoyable it was. Participants were paid different amounts of money to do this lying. The participants who were paid more, $20, to lie about their experience reported enjoying it less than those who were paid just $1 to lie. Here's a graph displaying the cognitive dissonance experiment I just referenced with the $20 versus $1. This is done by a psychologist named Festinger and Carlsmith. Their dissonance study, participants performed an extremely boring task and then reported to other participants how enjoyable it was. Some participants were paid $20 to lie and some were paid $1. Let's see that graph, the tall one on the right, that represents the people paid $1. Seems like an awfully dramatic difference. Post-decisional dissonance. Dissonance can arise when a person holds positive attitudes about different options but has to choose one of the options. For example, a person might have trouble deciding which college to attend. The person might narrow the choice to 2 or 3 alternatives and then have to choose. Post-decisional dissonance motivates the person to focus on one school's, the chosen school's, positive aspects and the other school's negative aspects. The event occurs automatically, with minimal cognitive processing and apparently without awareness. And for me, I think this happens when I visit ice cream shops and restaurants, because I rarely find things on menus that I won't like. Justifying effort. When people put themselves through pain, embarrassment, or discomfort to join a group, they experience a great deal of dissonance. To resolve the dissonance, they inflate the importance of the group and their commitment to it. This justification of effort helps explain why people are willing to subject themselves to humiliating experiences such as hazing. Attitudes can be changed through persuasion. Persuasion is the active and conscious effort to change an attitude through the transmission of a message. Factors affecting the persuasiveness of a message include the source, who delivers the message, content, what the message says, and the receiver, who processes the message. The elaboration likelihood model is the idea that persuasive messages lead to attitude changes in either of 2 ways, via the central route or via the peripheral route. The central route, most people are motivated or able to process information. Use of rational cognitive processes leads to strong attitudes that last over time and that people actively defend. The peripheral route is people are not motivated or able to process information. There's minimal processing of the message and it leads to more impulsive action. When people are motivated and able to consider information, they process it via the central route. As a result, their attitude changes reflect cognitive elaboration. That is what happens on the left side of this graphic. When people are either not motivated or not able to consider information, they process it via the peripheral route. As a result, their attitude changes reflect the presence or absence of shallow peripheral cues. For example, as a result of peripheral processing, people may be persuaded because the person making the argument is attractive or is a celebrity. People make judgments about others. The first thing people notice about another person is usually their face. The face communicates information such as emotional state, interest, competence, and trustworthiness. The amygdala is particularly important for judging trustworthiness. Nonverbal behavior. This consists of facial expressions, gestures, mannerisms, and movements by which one communicates with others. This is usually referred to as body language. Thin slices of behavior. This means seconds-long observations that offer powerful cues for impression formation. Attributions. These are people's explanations for why events or actions occurred. They attribute things. People are motivated to draw inferences in part by a basic need for both order and predictability. A psychologist named Hyder distinguished between 2 types of attributions, personal and situational. Personal attributions are explanations of people's behavior that refer to their internal characteristics such as abilities, traits, moods, or efforts. Situational attributions are explanations of people's behavior that refer to external events, such as the weather, luck, accidents, or other people's actions. A psychologist named Weiner noted that attributions can vary on other dimensions. They can be stable over time, permanent, or unstable, temporary, and they can be controllable or uncontrollable. Attributional bias. Correspondence bias. This is the tendency to expect that people's actions correspond with their beliefs and personalities. The fundamental attribution error. In explaining other people's behavior, the tendency to overemphasize personality traits and underestimate situational factors. In the actor-observer discrepancy, people focus on situations to explain their own behaviors while focusing on dispositions to explain other people's behavior. Stereotypes can lead to prejudice and discrimination. Stereotypes are cognitive schemas that help us organize information about people on the basis of their membership in certain groups. It allows for easy, fast processing of social information. It offers automatically largely outside of our awareness, and it helps us to streamline the formation of impressions, and it also helps us deal with the limitations inherent in mental processing. Illusory correlations. This is an example of psychological reasoning error of seeing relationships that do not exist. And subtyping. This is when people encounter someone who does not fit a stereotype. They put that person in a special category rather than alter the stereotype. Stereotypes may be positive, neutral, or negative. Negative stereotypes can lead to prejudice, which is negative feelings, opinions, and beliefs associated with the stereotype, and then discrimination, the inappropriate and unjustified treatment of people as a result of prejudice. Why do stereotypes lead to prejudice and discrimination? People treat others as scapegoats to relieve the tensions of daily living. People discriminate against others to protect their own self-esteem, and people tend to favor their own groups and stigmatize those who pose threats to their groups. Stereotypes can influence basic perceptual processes. Evidence suggests that special computerized training, in which race is unrelated to the presence of a weapon, can help police officers avoid racial bias in deciding when to shoot. In the picture on the left, participants were briefly shown a picture of a black or white face. The participants were then immediately shown an object and asked to classify it as a gun or tool. Participants primed by seeing black faces identified guns more quickly and mistook tools for guns. The study revealed that stereotypes can influence basic perceptual processes. Most people know that expressing negative stereotypes publicly can lead to trouble. Social norms have made it unacceptable for people to express prejudiced beliefs towards groups based on race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or gender. Which leads us to modern racism. This is a subtle form of racism, of prejudice, that coexist with the rejection of racist beliefs. Because people are reluctant to acknowledge explicit racist attitudes, researchers use questionnaires such as the Modern Racism Scale. Prejudice can be reduced. Imagining positive social interactions with outgroup members can reduce prejudice and increase pro-social behaviors toward outgroup members. Prejudice can also be reduced through explicit efforts to train people about stereotypical associations. Inhibiting stereotypes. People can override the stereotypes they hold and act in non-discriminatory ways if they wish. Numerous studies have shown that people can consciously alter their automatic stereotyping. Inhibiting stereotyped thinking is difficult and requires self-control. In one brain imaging study, the amygdala became activated when white participants were briefly shown pictures of black faces. The amygdala activity may indicate that the participants' immediate responses to black faces were negative. Perspective taking and giving. For taking, this is a technique that involves people actively contemplating the psychological experiences of other people. And perspective giving is a technique in which people share their experiences of being targets of discrimination. The critical roles in reducing prejudice of being heard for minority group members and listening for majority group members. For the minority Mexican immigrants, being heard led to more positive attitudes towards the outgroup. By contrast, perspective taking led to a worsening of attitudes. For the majority of white Americans, being heard led to more positive attitudes toward the outgroup, but listening produced even greater change. Disempowered groups may resent having to take the perspective of empowered groups. What determines the quality of relationships? The term relationships refers to connections with friends or romantic partners. Researchers have made considerable progress in identifying the factors that lead us to form relationships. For romantic relationships, psychologists have identified certain physical characteristics that are found to be more or less attractive in a potential partner. This includes proximity and familiarity. Proximity simply means how often people come into contact with each other because they are physically nearby. Proximity might have its effects because of familiarity. People like familiar things more than unfamiliar ones. Humans generally fear anything novel. Novel means new. This phenomenon is known as neophobia. People are also similar in attitudes, values, and interests and backgrounds and personalities, and they tend to like each other. The matching principle is the most successful romantic partners also tend to be the most physically similar. Personal characteristics. People tend to especially like those who have admirable personality characteristics and who are physically attractive. Least likable characteristics are related to dishonesty, insincerity, and lack of personal warmth. The most likable characteristics are kindness, dependability, and trustworthiness. Here is a graphic that shows the 10 most positive and most negative personal characteristics. You can review that if you wish. Physical attractiveness. Some standards of beauty, such as preferences for particular body types, appear to change over time and across cultures. There is a general tendency in mate selection for men to seek physical attractiveness and for women to seek status. One study found that men with the highest level of testosterone had faces with a higher width to height ratio, and that their faces were wider than they were high. If higher width to height ratio is a sign of dominance, then heterosexual women might be expected to find men with such characteristics most attractive. Researchers then had participants meet many potential partners using speed dating. Width to height ratio in men was associated with their perceived dominance, physical attractiveness, and likelihood of being chosen for a second date. Most people find symmetrical faces more attractive than asymmetrical ones. In a study on average faces, researchers found that as more faces were combined and averaged, the people rated that averaged face as more attractive. The "what is beautiful is good" stereotype. This is the belief that attractive people are superior in most ways. Kind of reminds me of the Kardashians. I really don't understand the emphasis on those people. And the evidence is mixed on the issue. All right, here's an example of the averaged faces. You can see there's all the different pictures. Below them are the numbers of the faces combined to make that face. The more faces that were averaged together, the more attractive people find the outcome. The face on the right, which is a combination of 32 faces, is typically rated as most attractive. Love is an important component of romantic relationships. Passionate love is a state of intense longing and desire. Companionate love is a strong commitment based on friendship, trust, respect, and intimacy. In most enduring relationships, passionate love evolves into companionate love. Adult relationships also vary in their attachment styles. Passion fades. It's not just a verb, it's a thing. It's a long-term pattern of sexual activity within relationships that shows a rise and then a decline. From the first year of marriage to the second, frequency of sex declines by about half. After that, the frequency continues to decline, but it does so more gradually. If people do not develop companionate forms of satisfaction in their romantic relationships, the loss of passion leads to dissatisfaction and often to the eventual dissolution of the relationship. Perhaps unsurprisingly, relatively few marriages meet the blissful ideals that newlyweds expect. Dealing with conflict. A psychologist named Gottman describes 4 interpersonal styles that typically lead couples to discord and dissolution. Those include being overly critical, holding the partner in contempt, being defensive, and mentally withdrawing from the relationship. Satisfied partners tend to express concern for each other even while they are disagreeing and may deliver criticism lightheartedly and playfully. Attributional style and accommodation. Happy couples also differ from unhappy couples in attributional style or how one partner explains the other's behavior. Happy couples make partner-enhancing attributions. They overlook bad behavior and respond constructively, a process called accommodation. Research with couples showed that people who loved their partners the most also idolized their partners the most. People with the most positively biased views of their partners were more likely to still be in the relationships with their partners several months later than were those people who were more realistic views of their partners. It is about viewing your partner kindly, not unrealistically. And that concludes part 2 of the lecture for Chapter 12, Social Psychology.